University of Massachusetts in Boston. His research focuses on 20th and 21st century literature and visual art from the US and Latin America. And he reads this type of work in relation to the development of the world system. He has done a number of exciting projects. Recently, he's co-edited a collection of essays titled Literary Materialisms, which came out in 2013 with Matthias Nilges. And he's also co-editing a volume that is now under contract called Literature and the Global Contemporary with Sarah Briette and Matthias Nilges. He's edited a special issue of Non-Site with Giulio Di Stefano, and his work has appeared in journals such as MLN, Studies in American Fiction, and 20th Century Literature. He's currently finishing a book project from which his talk today derives, I believe, that's called Forms of Unevenness, there's that title again, Literature and the Ends of Autonomy in the Americas. So please join me in welcoming Emilio Sauri.
Thank you. So I just want to start off by saying how much I appreciate receiving the invitation from both Alex and Jonathan to participate in the Luncheon series. And I also want to thank Heather Reed for setting up all the travel and accommodations, and especially Magali, Sarah, Alex, Matt, and Anita for being such absolutely gracious and welcoming hosts for these past 2 days. So thank you very much. So what I'm going to read today, I'm not going to give too much of a setup, but I do want to say that in a certain sense, the title obviously comes from the book, but in many ways, one of the questions that I'm asking is whether or not actually literature can still offer a means by which to read unevenness, okay? Hence the subtitle of the talk, which is Latin America and the Contemporary Novel in New World Time, something which I'll talk about at length. So in his last interview before his death, Roberto Bolaño observes that in Latin America, quote, economic underdevelopment doesn't allow subgenres to flourish. Underdevelopment only allows for great works of literature. Lesser works in this monotonous or apocalyptic landscape are an unattainable luxury, end quote. For this reason, he continues, although, quote, the writer aspires to meet these expectations, reality, the same reality that has fostered these aspirations, works to stunt the final product, end quote. No doubt what Bolaño points to here is how the novel in Latin America has long exhibited an acute awareness of the manner in which the movement of literary forms and genres across time and space reflect and often contest unevenly developed relations within the world system. But while his comments speak directly to this dynamic, how might we read 2666 itself? A novel which is, to a first approximation, something like a vast compendium of subgenres, ranging from the historical novel and detective fiction, through the thriller and Mexican narco-narrative, to romantic comedy. Thus, while Bolaño believes that underdevelopment only allows for great works of literature, it is also true that 2666 flies in the face of this assertion by making such subgenres the raw material of a novel that imagines itself, in its own words, a, quote, great, imperfect, torrential work, end quote. Indeed, we might say that what Bolaño has in mind here applies principally to a period in which the emergence of peripheral literatures had not only been marked by this awareness, but also tasked with addressing and even compensating for such unevenness. This is a period, in other words, when the accumulation of literary capital approximated the ideology of modernization, a desire for a form of modernity spurred on and at the same time circumscribed by the unevenly developed flows of global capital. What happens to the novel then when the conditions of possibility for social and economic modernization within the formerly developing world have been radically altered, if not altogether eliminated? This is the question I'd like to consider today, one which is in many ways central to the concluding chapter of my current book project, Forms of Unevenness. In it, I read literary and artistic works from Latin America and the United States with an eye to understanding what this relationship might tell us about the uneven development of the world system. I argue that what brings these two bodies of work together is not simply the history of hemispheric encounters, but rather a shared commitment to the question of autonomous form. This is a question of the artwork's relationship to the world and to its audience, but one which I claim is central to the political meaning of individual texts. Tracing the trajectory of this commitment and its critique from American modernism between the world wars to the Latin American boom novel in the 1960s and to the contemporary fiction and photography, I argue that while the works considered here present divergent conceptions of form, all are powerfully entangled with literature's efforts to imagine and interpret the unevenness that has long been the hallmark of a world system. A system in which the temporally and spatially complex processes of capital accumulation give rise to centers and peripheries that are tied together in a relationship of deepening inequality. This dynamic, of course, is no less apparent in the context of the Americas, where by the beginning of the 21st century, the per capita income of the United States was 5 times the Latin American average. What I want to turn to today is a massive transformation in that system that I argue not only underlies this intensification of an inequality, but also alters the configuration of 3 concepts: form, modernization, and autonomy. A configuration which, as Bolaño himself suggests, has long been central to the development of the Latin American novel. The consequences of this alteration become all the clearer in works of writers like Bolaño, but also César Aira, Pedro Mayral, or more recently, Valeria Luiselli. They have been no less central, however, to recent criticism and theory that asks what the contemporary has meant to the novel, and in turn should mean for comparative studies of the novel. And what is at stake in these questions, however, is whether novelistic form continues to offer a means by which to read the world's unevenness. Thus, Héctor Hoyos has recently noted in Beyond Bolaño, the global Latin American novel, that, quote, "It is ironic that after many decades in which the world had 2 dominant poles, the United States and the Soviet Union, critics seek to reaffirm center versus periphery dichotomies when multiple interconnected centers are quickly becoming a reality," end quote. Against this tendency, Hoyos sets out to define what he calls the global Latin American novel. Quote, "Works that may contribute to consolidating simultaneously both the world and Latin America as a chamber of resonance," end quote. Hoyos' primary interest, of course, lies in tracing the relationship between the 3 terms, global, Latin American, and novel, or more simply, between social and literary form. And yet, this image of a world comprised of multiple interconnected centers might give us pause, for while the ideological conflict between liberal capitalism and worldwide communism appears to have ended with the conclusion of the Cold War, we have every reason to be skeptical about the claim that the distinction between centers and peripheries no longer holds. At the very least, the fact that there are centers, whether multiple, interconnected, or not, implies the existence of peripheries. Nevertheless, Hoyos' contention finds a myriad of equivalents in recent Latin Americanist criticism, where, for example, Carlos Alonso claims that comparative methods developed by critics such as Frederick Jameson, Roberto Schwartz, and Franco Moretti, quote, "will not help us navigate the non-Western novel in the age of globalization and its unrelenting commodification of culture," end quote. Differences aside, it goes without saying that what brings Alonso's 3 critics together is an insistence on mapping the distinction between centers and peripheries. But while critics like Hoyos recognize that the global order is, in his words, still fundamentally uneven, it is as if they believe the point is to imagine a space in which that distinction ceases to matter. In this sense, literary criticism itself involves a compensatory gesture, a means of compensating for that unevenness. Now, none of this is to say that the end of the Cold War had no effect on the relationship between centers and peripheries, and indeed, part of what I'd like to suggest is that the contemporary Latin American novel is itself a formalization of a profound shift in the periphery's relation to the core, albeit one that finds its origins in an earlier crisis of capitalism. What follows is an historical shift which, beginning in the 1970s, as I'll show later, would eventually give rise to what the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Arantes describes as o novo tempo do mundo, or new world time, in which, quote, "the very modern notion of progress and the temporality of history that made it thinkable," end quote, is neutralized on a worldwide scale. But this also raises the question about the inclusion of global in Hoyos' triad of concepts, namely, what makes the global in the global Latin American novel, written by Bolaño, Aira, or Diamela Altit, any different than the global in, say, Machado de Assis, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or Borges, for that matter. One answer might lie in the world consciousness he sees struggling with the works of art at the level of form, one that presumably has displaced a national popular consciousness long identified with the novel. And yet, who exactly is the subject of this consciousness? For whatever we believe about the nation state, whether it's waning or not, post-national doesn't yet describe the world in which we live. And indeed, Hoyos' equal emphasis on Latin American suggests as much. But if the point is to highlight a dialectical tension between the global and the local, it is the tension that has long structured the novel at the level of form, as for example Schwartz's literary criticism makes clear. What then makes the contemporary novel global? From this perspective, we perhaps ought to conceive of the global not as a spatial category, but a temporal one, coeval with the contemporary, as Hoyos provocatively suggests in his evocation of the end of the Cold War, what he calls the, quote, long year of 1989, a period of time that spans more or less from the 1987 reforms of the Soviet Union through the end of the Civil War in El Salvador in 1992. Indeed, the end of the Cold War, he argues, created a, quote, aesthetic void in which long-standing solutions to the problem of how to put into words one's place in the world simply lose their edge. The ideological and aesthetic polarization of society pre-1989 provided a firm ground that no longer exists. He goes on, making sense of this transition is still a project in the making, end quote. To understand why this is the case, it is worth remembering that a similar sense of uncertainty was no less palpable even a decade and a half ago, as Pascale Casanova, for example, makes clear in her 1999 The World Republic of Letters, when, in the conclusion of the book's first part, she notes that, quote, the configuration of contemporary literary space is not easy to characterize, end quote. For Casanova, this has everything to do with the fact that, quote, a genuine literary internationalism is no longer possible, having been swept away by the tides of international business. Even the freest countries in the world, in world literary space, and obviously in her terms the most autonomous, she concludes, quote, are therefore subject to the power of international commerce, which in transforming the conditions of production modifies the form of books themselves, end quote. Within the context of Latin Americanist criticism, Casanova's claim finds an equivalent in what the critic Josefina Ludmer has recently described as literaturas post-autónomas, or post-autonomous literatures. For Ludmer, such works, quote, appear to be literature but cannot be read with literary criteria or categories like author, work, style, writing, and meaning, end quote. They cannot be read as literature, she adds, because, quote, they subject literature to a drastic operation of emptying out, end quote. Ludmer subsequently locates the origins of literature's post-autonomy in two postulates, and this is her. The first is that everything cultural and literary is economic, and that everything economic is cultural and literary. And the second postulate would be that reality, if considered from the perspective of the media, which continuously constitutes it, is fiction, and that fiction is reality. As Eugenio de Stefano and I have argued elsewhere, post-autonomous literatures would therefore seem to recall this kind of stereotypical account of the historical avant-garde's well-known attack on the category of work. Though the difference, according to Ludmer, is that the same gesture today acquires an entirely new significance following the end of literary autonomy, or as she puts it, the end of, quote, Bourdieu's field, which presupposes the sphere's autonomy or the thought of spheres, end quote. This is post-autonomous literature. Thus, post-autonomous literatures are not so much an attack on literary autonomy as they are a symptom of the collapse of what Bourdieu identifies as the field of restricted production, whose autonomy can be measured by its power to define its own criteria for the production and valuation of its products. This is a sphere in which symbolic goods are manufactured for those producers who establish criteria of aesthetic value, including what Ludmer designates literariness, in her words, of a work. For Ludmer, however, any claim to such irreducibility today ultimately fails to recognize, quote, new conditions of production and circulation of the book that modify ways of reading in the era of transnational book publishing corporations, or the book's role in major newspaper, radio, and television networks, as well as in other media, end quote. What this means then is that post-autonomous literatures get what other forms of writing don't. That it no longer makes any sense to insist on the irreducibility of the literary or art to the economic, political, or social phenomenon, or more simply on the distinction between art and non-art. No doubt this is a situation that has defined artistic production within the centers of global economy like the United States for some time now, a de-autonomization associated with what Frederick Jameson identified nearly 3 decades ago as, quote, postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism. And indeed, one cannot help but hear in Ludmer's account echoes of Jameson's claim that, quote, the theory of postmodernity affirms a gradual de-differentiation of these levels, the economic itself gradually becoming cultural, all the while the cultural gradually becoming economic, end quote. Importantly, this is the same de-differentiation between aesthetic and commodity production, which, according to Jameson at least, was attended by the rise of a situation within the first world in which, quote, we seem increasingly incapable of fashioning representations of our own current experience, end quote, by what Hoyos might describe as the problem of how to put into words one's place in the world, end quote. From a certain perspective then, the trajectory these critics trace points to the enlargement of a dynamic to which Jameson's term postmodernism refers, namely capitalism's ceaseless march across the globe into previously unincorporated enclaves of cultural production, now integrated into the market. Ludmer's account thus raises the question of whether the standpoint of Latin American cultural production today is any different than that of the first world, and it is precisely this indistinctness her notion of post-autonomous literatures would seem to register in approximating the vanishing point of postmodernism's own contemporaneity, a sense of the present which, according to Jameson, is no different than that of the commodity. And I kind of want to say, like, very clearly that, like, part of my argument is that what we are witnessing in contemporary literature is not the postmodernization of the novel, okay? And hopefully we'll see why in a moment. According to Ludmer, this emptying out of both the literary and its claims to representing the present as historical referent will have wide-ranging consequences, not only with respect to the way in which texts are circulated and read, but particularly in regard to what Adorno and Horkheimer had seen as the, quote, distinction between the logic of the work and that of the social system, end quote, a division that literature's assertion of autonomy had at least thought to formally provide. This social system is one in which labor processes of all kinds, including cultural ones, are directed towards the creation of value and its valorization. Said differently, without recourse to the logic of the work that such autonomy presumes, we must consider the literary object primarily in relation to what Marx understood as the, quote, unity of the labor process and the process of valorization in the capitalist process of production, or the capitalist form of the production of commodities, end quote. And if literature is, from this perspective at least, a commodity like any other, and part of what I'm saying is that it's not, then it can be said to play a significant role in the process of valorization represented by Marx's exchange formula MCM prime. From the standpoint of the same process of valorization, however, this also means that a literary text is no more significant, indeed no different, than say a Hollywood blockbuster, a saw, a toothbrush, or any other object. Of course, no commodity can fulfill this role unless it meets the demand imposed by the market, which is to say that to presume that literature is only a commodity like any other requires us to believe that what it is and does is determined exclusively by the effort to fulfill consumer desires and realize its exchange value. Consequently, if Ludmer believes that post-autonomous literatures cannot be read as literature, this is because what she cites as, quote, literary criteria or categories like author, work, style, writing, text, and meaning, end quote, all evince the same market-driven calculation that does not just efface the distinction between artworks and commodities, but also renders the distinction between literature and any other kind of object utterly irrelevant. Incidentally, the reader's or viewer's dispositions and experiences become all the more important. For what the work says about itself is, from the standpoint of the commodity, less important than what it might say to and about us as readers or consumers, since it is only in light of her or his response that the object has any value for the critic. Thus, what follows from the repudiation of categories like artwork or meaning is a deep investment in considerations of whatever effect the artwork, like any object, happens to produce. And so what we experience and who we are as subjects that experience become primary concerns. Indeed, this insistence on the commodity character of all literature and art more generally offers a means towards making the work's objecthood all the more conspicuous. Meanwhile, insofar as the market is everywhere, the differences between, say, the contemporary Latin American, European, or US novel ceases to matter. hence the perceived elimination of the center versus periphery dichotomy, the erasure of an unevenness. And yet, whether we think the novel is a commodity like any other, concepts like Ludmer's post-autonomous literatures presuppose some prior moment when literature's claim to autonomy was consistent enough to assume that a formalization of the literary field in Latin America was possible. A moment, that is, when the question of differentiating between aesthetic production and commodity production was still on the table. But as Julio Ramos observed in Desencuentros de la Modernidad en América Latina, quote, in Europe, literary modernization, which entailed the autonomization of art and the professionalization of writers, was a primary social process, distinctive of those societies on the threshold of advanced capitalism, end quote. In contrast, modernization in Latin America, quote, in all respects was and continues to be, at least in 1989, when he wrote Desencuentros, an extremely uneven phenomenon. In those societies, modern literature was not able to rely on institutional bases that would guarantee its autonomy, end quote. And this is because conditions made it impossible for the development of literature as an institution. That is, as a field that has been assigned the production of certain discursive norms and relative social specificity. This is no less the case in situations where literature, music, cinema, and art more generally played a fundamental role in the legitimation of the national popular state, even when it appeared to contest that legitimacy. In Latin America, therefore, the impulse was practically indissociable from the desire for modernity identified with a forceful dominant bourgeois culture, which, having developed in Europe, nonetheless presented itself as universal. Under these conditions, the autonomization of art was immediately bound up with a longing for a kind of development in progress that peripheral societies had everywhere been denied, a longing which, as we have already seen in Bolaño, a longing which we've already seen in Bolaño's claim that underdevelopment only allows for great works of literature. But this more recent moment stands in direct contrast to the literary field Ramos describes, which, having been defined by the uneven, incomplete articulation of autonomy to modernization in Latin America, now has been transformed by the end of modernization itself. Indeed, this moment, I would argue, finds its origins in what Giovanni Arrighi has described as a, quote, major reversal in the direction of global flows of capital, end quote, precipitated in the late 1970s and early 1980s by a crisis in the world system. In Arrighi's words, quote, the United States, which in the 1950s and 1960s had been a major source of world liquidity and of direct investment, in the 1980s became the world's main debtor nation and by far the largest recipient of foreign capital, end quote. This reversal subsequently resulted in, quote, radical changes in the overall context of third world development, end quote, which culminated in the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s as a, quote, flood of capital that third world countries and Latin American and African countries in particular had experienced in the 1970s turned into the sudden drought of the 1980s, end quote. Following this drought then, the illusions of developmentalism underwritten by loan capital offered on highly favorable terms would eventually collapse under the weight of structural adjustments in line with IMF and World Bank prescriptions, which, shifting the burden of crisis onto the developing world, would radically alter, if not altogether eliminate, the conditions of possibility for economic modernization. As Arrighi makes clear, however, quote, while the new strategy did not deliver on the promises of development, it did succeed in inducing third world countries to adapt their economies to new conditions of accumulation on a world scale, end quote. Conditions that form part of a broader and more brutal integration into the market, which, beginning in the early 1970s, extending through the 1990s, marked the so-called neoliberal turn within the region. So what I want to say is that the global, in Hoyos' title then, is what happens to the Latin American novel when the conditions of possibility for social and economic modernization within the formerly developing world have been radically altered. At the same time, the conviction that the problem of underdevelopment has been solved or overcome is treated as an error in a novel like 2666, at least on the level of narrative. This is most evident in the description of the fictionalized Ciudad Juárez, Santa Teresa, offered by the character of Chucho Flores. In Santa Teresa, Flores tells the African-American journalist Oscar Fate, and this is him, we have everything, factories, maquiladoras, one of the lowest unemployment rates in Mexico, a cocaine cartel, a constant flow of workers from other cities, Central American immigrants, an urban infrastructure that can't support the level of demographic growth. We have plenty of money and poverty. We have imagination and bureaucracy. We have violence and a desire to work in peace. There's just one thing we haven't got. Time. We haven't got any fucking time. Okay, can I say that? Okay. I hope that's okay. All right. All right. Chucho suggests that Santa Teresa is out of time in the sense of being in a place where time has ceased to progress and where the everyday rhythm of life itself has stalled to become part of what the novel calls the perpetual present. But Chucho also points to another sense in which Santa Teresa is out of time. For all its factories, maquiladoras, and urban infrastructure, none of these will lead to the development of Santa Teresa, Mexico, or the developing world. Fate himself acknowledges this when he thinks, quote, time for what? Time for this shithole, equal parts lost cemetery and garbage dump to turn into a kind of Detroit, end quote. Thus, the illusion of temporal simultaneity of the first world and third is ultimately revealed as the disappearance of a certain notion of time itself. The disappearance, in other words, of a sense of time being associated with the project of modernization, a project central to the Latin American nation state throughout the 20th century. What would have been seen at some other moment in history as a sign of the developing city's march toward modernity here becomes nothing more than a source of frustration for a class of entrepreneurs, managers, and technocrats with nowhere to go. In the wake of this collapse of modernization, all that remains is a developmentalism without development, and it is here, I think, that we see most clear what Aranchis calls o novo tempo do mundo, or New World Time, the neutralization of time in which, as he puts it succinctly, o progreso envelheceu, progress grew old. Yet, what this suggests is a disarticulation of autonomy and modernization, whereby all various literary techniques formerly aimed at achieving modernity now end up in a toolbox of means suited to different ends. And indeed, this exhaustion of a kind of modernizing impulse entails a newer configuration of form, modernization, and autonomy that may ultimately provide the literary with an unexpected political valence. This is perhaps nowhere more evident than in César Aida's extended writings on art, and particularly in Un episodio en la vida de un pintor viajero, or an episode in the life of a landscape painter. A novel in which the 19th century German documentary painter Johann Moritz Ruhendas travels to South America to record the landscapes of Argentina, Mexico, and Chile. Ruhendas, the novel explains, quote, was a genre painter, and his genre was the physiognomy of nature, based on a procedure invented by Alexander von Humboldt, which involves a kind of artistic geography, an aesthetic understanding of the world, a science of landscape, end quote. Ruhendas's paintings, however, will also recall the future of art, and in the opening pages, the narrator explains that, quote, his mission was one that 100 years later would have fallen to a photographer, end quote, to suggest that the exhaustion of this particular art form is imminent. The status of landscape painting subsequently calls into mind literature's post-autonomy, as the imminent exhaustion is doubled by the commercial success the artist's works enjoy throughout Europe, having been, quote, printed on wallpaper and even used to decorate china, end quote. But if Ruhendas's voyage will in this way appear to recall the fate of artistic autonomy in the 20th century, it is also the case that Aida's reflections on art, and the avant-garde in particular, suggest that the creation of new works or reinvention of art are not enough. Thus, in a well-known essay entitled La Nueva Escritura, or the New Writing, Aida observes that reinvention itself, quote, becomes more and more difficult, more costly, less gratifying, quote, end quote, within the context of the present. For Aida, the solution lies in the appropriation of the avant-garde's privileging of procedure, or procedimiento, over the final product itself, which, quote, was only good for feeding consumption or providing a narcissistic satisfaction, end quote. And unlike the commodity, the thrust of what Aida calls real art, as opposed to new art, is toward preserving the very processes of production dictated instead by a principle of selection internal to the work. And if a procedure will, in this way, provide some means towards distinguishing, however minimally, the work of art from commodities, it also forms a condition of possibility, however small, for an articulation of aesthetic autonomy today. The commitment to the work as an intentional art object is perhaps nowhere more evident than in Aida's description of his own procedure, what he famously calls la fuga hacia adelante, or the flight forward, which involves a self-imposed prohibition on making revisions, basically. The result is that, quote, the story must build on what was written the day before, end quote, forcing Ida to, in his own words, come up with ever new ideas and plot twists. Chance itself, Ida suggests, plays a similar role when he explains that, quote, if a little bird enters into the cafe when I'm writing, it did happen once, it also enters into what I'm writing. Even if a priori, it doesn't relate to anything, a posteriori, I make it relate, end quote. Far from undermining the commitment to the problem internal to the work itself, the introduction of random elements offers yet another constraint that forces the writer to outmaneuver the plot, so to speak, and in this sense, an opportunity to continuously make the intention legible. The result is often a plot that approximates surrealism's delirious imagery, for which Ida has become famous, though the point will not be to rehearse an investment in what is stereotypically understood as the shock the avant-garde sought to produce in the viewer or reader. Less concerned with the reader's experience or responses, in fact, what Ida's procedure gives rise to is nothing less than a self-legislating form that foregrounds its own conditions of production, and in so doing reintroduces those questions about meaning and representation that the conflation of artwork and commodity must, according to Lubemer, disregard. Considering the historical avant-garde's hostility to the category of work itself, Ida's appropriation of its most characteristic techniques may seem odd. Yet in Latin America, such appropriations find their historical origins neither in the attack on autonomy nor in the effort to annul the category of work, characteristic of its European counterparts, but rather in the very incompleteness and unevenness of that autonomy. Thus, in Latin America, where writers continuously encountered those conditions endemic to peripheral literary production, the creation of new vanguards was more often than not undertaken with an eye to the cancellation of autonomy, but to the world republic of letters and a form of compensatory modernity, so that the autonomization of literary sphere denied everywhere but uneven development was widely conceived as the mark of the avant-garde's success. And I think, I mean, this is one way of understanding like precisely what the boom means within this context. In the wake of the collapse of modernization, however, the disarticulation of autonomy and modernization suggests that all the various literary techniques formerly aimed at achieving modernity can now be appropriated for different ends. Thus, in Ida's novel, Ruhenas eventually encounters something like the other side of his art, not by means of the new, but in the discovery of a principle underlying his own work, namely what he calls repetition. For what such repetition involves is, in his words, quote, handing down of a set of tools that produces a more complete encounter with history, end quote, precisely because it is, according to Ruhenas, quote, born of a deliberate resolution, end quote, born, that is, of an intention, or as Ida himself might put it, a procedure. And what this principle or procedure allows us to see is a set of specific motivations and intentions independent of the reader's experience that returns us to the artwork, to questions of meaning and interpretation, and in this sense, perhaps even to the possibility of making history of the uneven present finally appear. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was terrific. I'd like to ask you to, in advance of questions and this discussion, if the complement, right, I mean, sort of the archetypal version of the kind of postmodernization effect is relatability, right? That's the symptom, let's say, of this perpetual present. I'm less familiar with, unfortunately, with 2666, but with the Savage Detectives. But what strikes me in this, and I think this is your argument, but I'd like to ask you about a term. I can't help but notice the resonance between Savage Detectives and the Lost Steps, like and in that latter book, right, there's this sort of idea of indigeneity as switching over from the European avant-garde's bloated relationship to its past and the kind of murderousness of that, to indigeneity as the kind of ground, let's say, the new ground for marvelous real. But more interestingly, the relationship between those two books does emphasize process. and a proceeding sort of not only in terms of narrative, but in terms of working through, let's say the archive of the contemporary, whether it's musical instruments or other figures or so forth, other avant-gardes. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this kind of proceduralism that you're talking about in terms of two ideas that seem to come to the fore, at least in the framework that I'm thinking of. One is archaism, not again as like a romance of the past, but actually as an archaeological project. And the second, and I think related to this, and I'm borrowing this from Michael Fried, I had to check to make sure it was Michael Fried, not T.J. Clark, is absorption. Not as affect, but actually as a formal construct, let's say for him, for Fried in painting, that directs one toward this pull away from the theatrical present in which one sees or reads a work, but toward, let's say, its vanishing point. So I wonder if you could work through those two terms, archaism and absorption, in terms of your framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, thanks for that question. I mean, that's great. And immediately, like, what I want to say is that, like, in a certain sense, those 2 points are, like, totally related, right? Because the first part is the question of absorption, at least as understood by Fried, right, is always that sort of fiction as if, like, the viewer or beholder doesn't, like, who's standing in front of the painting doesn't actually there, right? Doesn't actually exist. And so it's a kind of means by which, and even in, like, absorption and theatricality, or even earlier work like art and objecthood, like Fried isn't actually talking about the questions of autonomy, right? But nonetheless, once you begin to see the way in which the redefinition of what it is that literature is and does, at least within the context of certain Latin Americanist discourses, contemporary ones, is all directed towards sort of redefining that relationship between the reader and the text, right? And in such a way that, like, in Friedian terms, it would be like utterly theatrical, okay? Now, the way I see it is kind of related to the archaism that you're speaking of. I mean, is that in many ways, I mean, Ida's like an incredibly interesting figure, and I should point out that, like, Hoyos dedicates like a really fascinating chapter to him and Beatin, and like talks about like Ida's own relationship to an artist like Duchamp. But getting back to the point, I mean, I think that, like, the point is that, like, it's first of all not an archaism insofar as, like, the appropriation of the form, like, means something utterly different within the contemporary moment, right? But it is the case that, like, there is a kind of going back to a kind of archive, as you put it, in order to sort of think through questions about, like, art in such a way that may not have been possible in a prior moment, right? In a way that, like, in many ways is only possible at a moment when, like, the whole sort of structure of the literary field is not oriented towards something like this sort of compensatory modernity, And so, like, I hesitate with the word archaism just for all the connotation that it involves, but I think that, like, archaeological might be a good a way of thinking about it. And I like the comparison to Lost Steps in that sense. But even then, like, it becomes a very different project, right? Because what's Carpentier most invested in? He's invested in a kind of, like, literary form that in a lot of ways produces a kind of means of understanding the reality of Latin America. And, and that later will become a kind of foundation for, but not at all the same thing as something like magical realism. Right? So.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the talk, and I would love to hear more about Bolaño. I mean, 2666 is such a sprawling book, and your reading focuses on such a kind of punctual moment in it.
Yeah.
And I think that it's such a remarkable thing to say of that book that it demonstrates something like that temporalization rather than the spatialization of globality. That's what you said, if I'm paraphrasing you right. Principally because it does involve, as so many of Bolaño's books do, global travel, right. Multilocality, different institutional settings, specifically in this book, academic and juridical institutions in different places. That it would seem to be demonstrating something like very much a spatialized globality. So what you're saying is in some ways very counterintuitive, and so I want to hear more about it, maybe by way of some other element. And to throw one more bone, it's not just a thematic element, right, in terms of travel and international institutions. It's also formal. You listed a bunch of genres. The genre that was missing is the genre of list, associated most, at least through Bolaño, with Perec. Yeah. And the thinking of an expansion into that second book, this list of the dead of Ciudad Juarez, of a kind of Perecian list. I guess that would seem again to demonstrate something like a spatial relation between that European avant-garde over there, now co-present with the Latin American avant-garde over here. Right. So I guess I just wonder, given those two ways of reading 2666 as a spatialization of globality, how do we hold on to this? Because I love the temporalized reading, I just can't see it beyond that Chucho Flores moment.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of things I would say about that. Like, the first is that in a lot of ways, this is actually like a reading, the reading that you're kind of calling for is like a reading that actually Sheree Decker like produces like brilliantly. And the conclusion she comes to is that like what you get in Bolaño is a kind of concretization of like all these sort of like very local points, right? But that like the movement between them, like formally, like in the novel itself, like all of a sudden points to like the possibility of tracing out this totality, right? But what I want to say is then like, how does then the question of temporality come into this? And in a certain sense, I think that, and actually I've recently published a piece on 2666 that appears in the Canadian Review of Comparative Literature, so you can get a better sense and a more complete sense there. But what I'd say is that like, especially that moment with the part about the crimes, which is the fourth section of the novel, right? What is the point of that list, right? And why must it be repeated over 100 times, like all these various descriptions? Like, I mean, is it necessary? And like one way of understanding it would be like, well, he wants to shock us. He wants us to feel like the gravity of the situation and to sort of be compelled to like do something about it, right? But in a certain sense, I think that it's quite the opposite, right? And in many ways, it kind of gets back to this question of like absorption versus theatricality, as well as the sort of like question of like one returning to certain questions about literary form in themselves acquire a kind of political valence, right? So in my reading of it, the point is that like it's not an attempt actually to incite the response from the reader. It's not an attempt to sort of compel the reader to act. In fact, it's over and over and over again an attempt to like almost, I mean, I want to say like it's to insist on the distance between the reader and like what's going on, right? Like to insist that like if we are going to have any relationship to these horrific murders that are going on, it cannot be the kind of liberal, for lack of a better word, like response, which would be like, how horrible, what are we going to do? Let's like start a Kickstarter fund or something, right? Like it can't be that, right? And that in a certain sense, what Bolaño is most invested in and what allows for him to actually think about and even posit as a question our own relationship to like that particular point in like the whole of the totality of social relations, right, is insisting on that distance, right? That's and the temporality of that comes precisely, I think, insofar as that like that becomes a kind of possibility open to like the writer like after this sort of collapse of modernization that I'm describing. So I mean, there's much more I can say about that. Like The Savage Detectives is also like a kind of great way of thinking about this question, but through the opposite end, because like I think in a lot of ways what The Savage Detectives is pointing to is like the exhaustion of a certain conception of the literary, right, in Latin America, and like the ending of that novel is basically like an opening to like what the literary might become. And 2666 in a certain sense is a kind of like response to that, you know? So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sarah?
That was really great, thanks. I was wondering about Brazil, and we talked a little bit, obviously the situation there is completely, sort of, deteriorating at the moment or very contested, but there has been this recent enthusiasm, this sort of actually this return to the idea of Brazil as the land of the future, and even a sort of return to a lot of the tropes. Lula gets compared to Leo Vargas, and all these right, a return to sort of, well, I don't know if it's a return. This is my question, I guess. So how do you read that? Is that sort of a last gasp of this idea of modernization, even though it's within this kind of neoliberal framework? So, right, how do you see the situation in Brazil and what its relation to the literary there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, first, thanks for that question. And it is a question that actually often comes up when like I'm kind of insisting on this sort of like exhaustion of the modernizing impulse. But it seems to me that one thing we can say is that the very conditions of possibility for modernization at a certain point are altered. And it may not be that they're necessarily completely exhausted, right? But it is the case that like modernization projects, development projects all of a sudden become lucrative means of accumulation, right? So that in a certain sense, in a prior moment you had something like right versions and left versions of like modernization projects, but what they all insisted on was a kind of like autonomy of the process, right? And today, like modernization projects on a whole, like are basically like places to accumulate capital, like means by which to accumulate capital. So I think that like, in a certain sense, that's kind of a refinement maybe of what I'm trying to say, but it's nonetheless like suggesting that like we're in a very different place, right? And I mean, we might think about like the sort of economic boom of like Brazil in the last decade or so, which is now obviously like on decline. But that is a boom, as everybody knows, that was like facilitated by like high commodity prices, right? And it's not necessarily one that is facilitated by like the sort of investments in like infrastructure, like that had marked a kind of like prior moment in development projects, right? And I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that like that's one way of getting at the question. But I don't know if that's necessarily like what you're thinking of. So.
No, I mean, yeah, that was sort of my question. I guess just what you see. I don't really work that much on the contemporary period, but in terms of the literature there, if there's any, within this recent time period, if there had been any sort of significant difference from, say, Mexico or other places.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know, like. Obviously the novel that comes to mind immediately is like Cidade de Deus, right? And what's interesting is that like it's almost as if like that's the last gasp of a moment where it's almost like that's like the last moment in this sort of dialectic of like modernization and form, right? Like, and especially if you think about a critic like Schwartz, who focuses on 19th century Brazil, but also like on Brazilian modernism, like the three contemporary texts that come immediately to mind that he looks at, right, are Caetano Veloso's Verdade Tropical, Chico Buarque's Estrovo, and Cidade de Deus, right? And Cidade de Deus like is like basically like that moment where it's just like the last sort of like the crumbling precisely of that like of a kind of national popular like possibility, right? And I didn't get into it here, but it seems to me also that like one way we can begin to think about this is also not simply in terms of like structural adjustment as it makes its way across like Latin America, but also in terms about the recomposition of labor, right? And Alex and I were talking about this yesterday, right? And a lot of this could be drawn from political economy of a German school called Wertkritik, or value critique, where like essentially what you get is a kind of moment in history of capital where it becomes more and more difficult to like exploit labor, right? And in fact like labor is like repelled right? In a way that it hadn't been previously, and like in a scale that it hadn't been until like the 1970s it begins, right? Not to get too much into the technical aspects of the argument, you can see that like, you know, obviously like manufacturing was like one of those places where like people were brought together, and like the National Popular moment was a moment that like facilitated that, greased the wheels of that process. What happens then like when like, you know, all we have are something like favelas, ciudades perdidas, you know, villas, miserias, and like those people aren't being integrated into the economy in the same way that there was in a previous moment, in a moment where like the development projects were like sort of facilitating that. So.
Yeah, just a comment. I'm not being too clear today, so let me just acknowledge that right out. So first, just a comment on what we were talking about earlier. I think that you know, that moment in change between the 70s and then the end of modernization and the end of development, you know, has a history of the collapse of the Bretton Woods agreements, has a history of a movement that, to put it bluntly, is away from development and a far more blunt accumulation by dispossession.
Right.
And the problem with accumulation by dispossession is when your labor starts to see that they're being dispossessed, you reach a point where they're not willing to throw their, it's a form of resilience of labor that they won't throw in there. You know, it's easier to sit in the favela when you, instead of working for a modernism that's never going to reach. Maybe. So I just to put that there. That wasn't the question I was going to ask you.
Okay, okay.
But it is something I've been thinking about though, which is forms of slumming as forms of resilience. So I just thought I'd throw that in. Not that I'm recommending that around here, at least not until we do my program. Okay, so the other thing that is an interdisciplinary kind of comment, a very interdisciplinary comment, which it goes like this, that in working on forms of autonomy in bioethics, as well as in, but it hasn't touched modernism, I don't think, except through some feminist critique, there's a very clear understanding of the fiction of the autonomous. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's the fiction of the autonomous in relation to the fact that real autonomy actually entails vulnerability. And it's the feminist philosophers who've done the most amount of work on that. Right? So that when I come as an Africanist to start looking at this, it seems to me that it's not just that the global south is moving in different directions because of the you know, recognition, not recognition, that's the wrong word, their affirmation of the fact that they know already that they're going to be left out of the dream of modernism for all kinds of eco reasons as well as everything else. I mean, we just don't have enough worlds to make everybody modern. It's also the fact that I don't know if there was ever the mythology of autonomy in that kind of way. In relation to the individual, in relation to the nation state, and in relation to the notion of autonomy as utopia.
Are we talking about the African context in particular?
No, I'm trying to extend it to the global south, because I'm thinking of the work that I've done in Indigenous Australia as well. Okay, okay. And especially in those places in Australia, even in white novels, where there's a strong understanding of what happens, as has happened in Brazil, with commodity economies that rise and fall like this, like, you know, like overflowing bathtubs and drought within a few years. There's a, you know, that really sort of makes you question the story. Right. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I mean, I'm trying to say that I think that there's a kind of a speaking back from the south of these forms that one can see. That the speaking back is not intentional, and it's certainly not the first priority of the literary form. But it does have something to do with a critique of the autonomy of modernism in the first place.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, no, that makes sense, makes complete sense. I mean, and it's part of like, I think that, you know, I would agree insofar as like part of what my book project is trying to do is like trace the development of the sort of commitment to working through the question of autonomy, but it's not always a kind of commitment to autonomy itself, right? It's actually like often also posited as a kind of critique of that. Right, and that looks different in different contexts, but I think what you're suggesting then is that actually that critique of autonomy is part and parcel of like even more contemporary like moment, right? And yeah, and of course, I mean, I think that like you're going to have any number of artists and writers in particular who like are very aware of this. Like, I mean, in the Latin American context, right, the person who articulates this best is Jorge Volpi, and particularly in Insomnio de Bolívar, where he talks about precisely like, you know, if in a prior moment, like the writers of the boom, right, gave rise to this thing called Latin American literature, and he always puts a kind of copyright symbol next to it, right, which is great. He says like, if they were so invested in literary, in a kind of like literary autonomy, for lack of a better word, although I don't think he uses the word autonomy, then like the writers today like are like totally invested in like money. Like they get it. Like they're playing the game to win, right? And winning means like getting a readership, and getting a readership like leads to like getting paid, right? And in a certain sense, yeah, I think that like there are going to be writers like that. But I think that like, as I try to sort of explain in the article I mentioned a moment ago, that yeah, that like essentially like even the sort of claim to sort of playing the game, like the fact that there's a kind of awareness, let's say conscious awareness on the part of like the writer that they are part of a market, they are sort of like, you know, conceding to like certain demands on the market or repelling them, right? That doesn't necessarily like eviscerate, or a less dramatic word, like cancel out like what the form itself might be doing, right? That in a certain sense, like the possibility that's sort of opened up by
well, that would be an intentional fallacy.
Yeah, no, right. If you sort of thought of it as like, you know, what they think they're doing is what it means, right? So that would be kind of my response, yeah. So it's always the new critics. We just come back to them, so.
I was curious about your inclusion of Valeria Luiselli in your list at the beginning.
Yeah.
In part because, and I'd like to just ask you to talk more about including her in this sort of moment that you're defining, because what your inclusion of her name pointed out to me, a little bit about your talk, but also about Orius's book, is that there's a sort of conversation around this turn in this moment, which isn't just 89, right?
Yeah, right.
But is people born well before 75, let's say?
Mm-hmm.
And Luiselli born, I think, after 1980, right?
Yeah.
And that there was a serious, what your inclusion of that name brought to light for me was a serious sort of generational split between the writers who are engaging with this moment. And I wonder if you have more to say along those lines. I don't want to fetishize generation as a category, and yet I think there is something sort of significant, especially if we take the sort of 70s as a key turning decade,
yeah,
talking about people who were alive before then and alive only after then, let's say, and it's after us.
Yeah, I mean, so in part I'm including Luiselli because like I'm writing something for a volume on Mexican literature and theory now that I decided to like focus on her book, and some of it has to do with photography as she like incorporates in La Historia de mis Dientes like photographs. The thing I think is like fascinating about that book, I mean, actually she just published a really short article on in the Financial Times on the novel, and in it she says something to the effect of like, well, you know, we might think of it like, precisely like in Blumer's terms, that like these new technologies have all of a sudden like altered like what the novel is and what the novel does and how we, you know, read the novel, right? And like the point that she makes is that like in writing the novel that she did, and there's a very like elaborate process that she goes under to write it that involved like incorporating comments and recordings from workers who worked at the Jumex factory just outside of like Mexico City. And like she says that like doing all these sort of things, right, I kind of realized that I was just doing a kind of version of Dickens' like serial novel, right? And she's like, in a certain sense, what does that mean? I mean, it means that like there's a kind of way in which the novel as a form, right, doesn't really change all that much. I mean, like, and that even in light of all these technologies that we're told are sort of like altering our sort of relationship to it and what it's doing, that essentially like, no, the form itself is consistent, right? So what then does it mean to actually understand the form is consistent, right? Like, and in terms of like the generational divide, right, I think that's kind of important insofar as I think that like the 1970s, and I'll say this actually, like I don't think it's too controversial to say that like is just as important for Latin American literature today as it is for American literature, right? And that like there's a kind of moment in which returning to the 1970s in a number of recent fiction points, I think in a certain sense, to do the attempt to do a version of like the historical novel. Why? Because in order to do like a history of the present, right, you can't go back to the 60s. Like the history of the present like is basically its origins are in the 1970s, right? In the sort of the moment that's like in Latin America structural adjustment, but also in New York City where structural adjustment like takes off first, right? So in a certain sense, I think that that division, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think that that generational divide is important, right? And it's one that I think that like older writers are probably acutely more aware of, right? Like Pedro Maidal would be another one that I would point to. And like I haven't really thought about like her relationship to that generation. I mean, I think I often like, probably to a fault, don't think in terms of like generation. But I know that like a lot of people have sort of like taken that point up like more recently, so.
Great, well, we're out of time, so please join me in thanking you.